Good evening, everyone. I'm your host, Jason Miles, on another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Glad to have you here. If you like what we're doing, please hit like and subscribe. It is a passive gesture that goes a long way. If you're a returning listener, subscriber, or one of the very valued patrons that will join me for movie night part 2, well, all right. For those that join me for these last two morning shows, thank you so much. And I hope you all appreciate it. As I said on Monday, there will be no Saturday show as I'm going up north to see my eldest graduate from college. Shout out. So I decided to do some early morning streams to make up for the TIR absence. Also, don't forget, tonight we're doing our second Jason's Fun movie night. If you want to join us for this movie night, there are a few ways. Become a patron or a paid YouTube subscriber. For as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year, you can access champagne rooms and our patron-only call-in shows. Also, that $3 makes sure that we can stay on the air. All that being said, after the show, fun-ass movie night. Get your popcorn ready. Now, depressing show topic. Don't cheer for that. That's what you cheer for. Weirdos. People are crazy. Seriously. Remembering Vietnam. Talk about this evening. There is, at the outset, a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam. And I watched this program broken and eviscerated, as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that what America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. And so we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. And so we watch them in brutal solidarity burning the huts of a poor village. But we realize that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor. That was an excerpt from Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech he gave April 4th, 1967, called Beyond Vietnam. At that point, the Vietnam War was a little over 10 years old, and in 2 years, the U.S. would send in 150,000 more troops to continue the war effort. Dr. King's anti-war stance cost him support, and his righteous dissent from the war had him labeled a traitor. Dr. King understood the intersection of U.S. imperial might, racism at home and abroad, the contradiction of militaristic police repression and nonviolence as a strategy, and of course, how America will mine its poor as fodder for the war machine. Tonight, as we look back at the 50-year aftermath of the fall of Saigon, what lessons have been learned from the war in Vietnam? In this current era of proxy wars, the facelessness of drone warfare, and end to conscription, have these functioned to cripple a once vibrant anti-war movement? Join us as we look back at what led us into an almost 20-year conflict, costing the lives of nearly 4 million people. Here to take us on this deep dive into Vietnam is the co-host of the Green and Red podcast and history professor, Bob Buzzanco. Sorry, got a little tongue-tied. How are you?
Good. Thanks again. And it's good to talk to you again.
Well, first of all, thank you for agreeing to come on the show, and shout out to your co-host Scott Parkin for letting me know that you're kind of the go-to guy to talk to about this. And I hate to ask such an elementary question to start the show off, but why not ask a person that, this is what they did for a very long time for a living. But what really led the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War?
Let me try to do the TLDR version of that. After the U.S. had very little, if any, interest in Vietnam throughout World War II. Japan had occupied Vietnam in World War II. It had been a French colony before that. After the war, France decided to re-enter Vietnam, and the U.S. actually was not in favor of that. They believed that France should just forget about its colonies in Asia and focus on Europe, where the Cold War really mattered as far as the U.S. was concerned. But France went in, so the United States kind of had to back France because it was an ally. And in addition to that, and that's kind of I think the typical narrative that you'll get when you read about these things. But in addition to that, I think actually the post-war vision for Asia was really important. The United States wanted to create a capitalist Asia, and the bulwarks of that would obviously be Japan, and in 1945, China. Well, obviously in October of 1949, that part of it fell apart. So the United States, in order to put Japan in a position where it could rebuild and thrive as a capitalist country, wanted to make sure that the other countries in that area would be accommodating. And in places like Malaya and Vietnam, there were nationalist communist revolutions going on. And so the U.S., both to support France, because it didn't want France kind of going off the reservation, so to speak, with regard to the Cold War in Europe, and to try to make sure that Japan had countries nearby where it could get resources, it could get investment, it could trade, decided to make a commitment to Vietnam, even though within the United States, there really wasn't a great deal of enthusiasm for that. And in fact, the military thought it was a bad idea. That's actually the focus of the first book I wrote on that, the military in Vietnam. The military thought Vietnam was useless, not really useless, but not terribly important.
Really?
Everybody, they wanted to be in Europe. They wanted to fight against the Russians in the Cold War. And a place like Vietnam, in addition, it's kind of strange. There were actually American OSS agents before the CIA, the OSS on the ground, who were helping rescue downed flyers. And Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were helping the American OSS. And so these people wrote these really positive reports about Ho Chi Minh, and said, just let them have their independence. And they were comparing Ho Chi Minh to George Washington and Joan of Arc and things like that.
Wow. Was it because
it was really quite striking?
Oh, no.
But the larger imperatives of the Cold War. Thank you for a minute there. Oops. I'm sorry, I lost you for a minute there.
Can you hear me, Bob? Oh no.
Live TV.
Can you hear me? Bob.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Bob, can you now?
Oh no. Did we lose you? There you go. Okay, you're here. Okay.
Yes, I can.
So we lost you at Ho Chi Minh. You got something happened with your connection.
I'm sorry. I don't know. Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, the United States, actually, a lot of these Americans said Ho Chi Minh is like George Washington. Sure, they're communists, but that's fine. It's not that important. But the larger imperatives of the Cold War and then what I would call economic imperialism in Asia clearly were more vital to that decision.
And that's what gets the U.S. in the war. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and it begins, I mean, the commitment is initially small, but then by the early 1950s, the U.S. is sending hundreds of millions of dollars to an area that was really unimportant prior to that. And in 1950, $400 million is a lot of money.
Yeah.
1950. So it's a significant commitment made against their own better judgment. Actually, even
Mhm.
like Eisenhower thought it was a bad idea. And then once, oh, go ahead.
No, was it the U.S. under the impression that post World War II they were just the automatic battle machine that could, of course, smother this small um, country in the South Pacific?
Yeah. I mean, and in that regard, what the US did wasn't illogical. Why wouldn't they assume that they could defeat Vietnam very easily and very quickly?
Yeah.
But again, there were people within the US military saying, not so fast, hold your horses. But they just ignored that because, right, they had just won World War II, the only real superpower in the world. You have the Soviet Union, but the U.S. still has overwhelming, advantages in all kinds of weaponry and
And
obviously economic.
and
So,
military.
yeah, there wasn't a lot of hand wringing about it, other than people like Matthew Ridgway, who was the chief of staff, and James Gavin, who was, I think, the army planning chief or something like that. So there were military people saying, "Whoa, it's not that easy," but they were pretty easily silenced.
Is it true that France gave the U.S. a warning
Yes.
after their shellacking that, hey, maybe you guys don't want to play over here in the swamp in the jungle?
Yeah, and what's surprising is how little that came up. A few people brought that out. George Ball, who was kind of a like the official dissident within the administration in the '60s, would mention that. A few military people. I found a document from I believe the commandant of the Marine Corps, one of the major chiefs, who said, you see what happened to France? Well, that could happen to us too.
Yeah.
So they were aware of that, but that's France, right? France, what did France do in World War II, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
So I didn't really take that terribly seriously, and they just ignored it. Yeah.
That's frightening.
Um,
Um, Go ahead.
and well,
No, no, you please go ahead, please.
well, the one thing I think is, well, I think there's one salient thing here because in 1954, so from in 1946, what we call the first what American historians call the first Indochina War began between the Viet Minh, which was a nationalist force, it was also a communist force,
Mhm,
against France. And that ended in 1954, just like the anniversary would have been a couple of weeks ago at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And the Viet Minh defeated France and France left. They were smart enough to get out finally. And at that point, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh thought that they had conquered Vietnam and they would now be leaders of a unified country, right?
mhm.
Uh, uh, because there were three in Vietnam. And Ho actually had thought this in 1945 too, after World War II, because the Ho Chi Minh and the communists had led the resistance in the World War II. But then in 1954, instead of Ho taking control of the country, the U.S. partitioned, the U.S. and other countries at a conference partitioned Vietnam in half and
Mhm.
created a country to the south. I call it inventing Vietnam. They invented the country. They just kind of, at the 17th parallel, they cut Vietnam in half. And then they had to find somebody who could run the country in the South. Anybody who had any legitimacy was connected to the Viet Minh, to the Nationalist Front. And so they found this guy who had been kind of floating around the United States, among other places, No Dinh Diem, who had been friends with people like John F. Kennedy and Francis Cardinal Spellman, who's a Catholic. And so
Mhm.
they put him in charge, but they promised elections in 1956. And there was never any real thought of actually having those elections, because even Eisenhower said if there's elections, Ho Chi Minh is going to win 90% of the vote. Everybody who surveyed it in the United States, CIA, Army intelligence, you name it, all said the same thing. If there's real elections, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh are going to get 80-90% of the vote. And so that's kind of what led the U.S. to go all in. They
Mhm.
invented this country, and then you're kind of stuck with it, right?
Mhm.
And it was a very repressive country. Ziem and his brother, No Dinh New, took people, they put them in the jails. They had like 140,000 people in their jails. There were a couple
Wow.
prisoners camps where they just induced famines and killed thousands of people, which I think is relevant because of what we're seeing right at this very moment in Gaza, right? Using famine as a political weapon. And the U.S. just, kept ratcheting up aid. The more repressive ZM became, the U.S. kind of sent more aid in because he's our guy.
Mhm.
Didn't have a lot of popular support. In addition to that, like I said, he was a Catholic. Vietnam is a Buddhist country, a big majority Buddhist country.
Mhm.
And that became a political issue as well by the early 1960s. So it wasn't like, how did this happen? It's easy to say, oh, how did this happen? But once you started to see what happened after 1954,
Mhm.
the optimism was misguided. It was misplaced.
Is it optimism or arrogance or a little bit of both?
Well, it's certainly, but I mean, William Fulbright famously called it the arrogance of power, and yeah, there's hubris involved, absolutely.
Mhm.
Um, you defeated, the Nazis in World War II, and the American and Donald Trump's version, right?
Mhm.
The Red Army is kind of already like kind of an afterthought to the Americans, but you won World War II. You came out of the war with almost no damage. Europe is just
Yeah.
devastated. Asia's
Yeah.
devastated. The U.S., the war's not taking place in North America. So it's arrogance, but it's not really misplaced, right? Because why would this ragtag peasant army, or however they described it, be a concern? And there were people there who understood it. I mean, the Marine Corps famously stressed things like what they would call counterinsurgency or pacification, later known as the hearts and minds approach. And so there
Mhm.
were people there saying, hey, they're fighting a different kind of war. We have B-52s and we have tanks. That's not going to help us in the jungles in this guerrilla war, right?
Mhm.
And they were just, people ignored them. They just said, whatever, you're being difficult.
Why didn't the tanks help him in the guerrilla war?
I mean, it's a people's war. The vast majority of Vietnam's population lives within like 10 miles or 20, 50 miles at most of the coast, and they're in villages. It's
Mhm.
a traditional society in villages. And
Mhm.
the Viet Cong, who after 1960 become the Viet Cong, they're deeply
Mhm.
integrated into these villages. They're not, and the U.S. line, which if you look even up to this day, like the PBS series that
Oh,
was
no.
Ken Burns did, right?
Mhm.
Basic American line, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, right? And that's um, there weren't North and South Vietnams, prior to that time. So the Viet Minh were integrated throughout Vietnamese society, North and South. National Liberation Front of the Viet Cong in the South tended to be indigenous to the South. So when the U.S. went in with this heavy duty firepower, and they, search and destroy, kill everything that moves, they weren't, this wasn't surgical. They would, the body count was like, we killed this many Viet Cong. No, you killed that many Vietnamese. And that could be 90-year-old women. It could be
Yeah.
children. It could be water buffalo. They would just put that down as part of the body count and claim, oh, look at what we're doing. What they're doing is devastating the entire country and damaging the political, whatever little political influence they had. They were just the French. They were just the Vietnams fought off 1 million invaders over the years. And the US was just another one. They were like France, they were like Japan, they were like China, they were like the Mongols or
Mhm.
whatever. And it really alienated the American destruction, really alienated. The US B-52s were built for the Cold War in Europe. And one Air Force general in 1957 said, like, I can't believe they're using B-52s in Indochina, right?
Mhm.
It was just incomprehensible that you would use these massive planes that could, carpet an area 1 by 2 square miles, 2 square miles, 1 by 2, in one sortie. And they're doing this and just destroying everything in sight. And they're using dioxin and Agent Orange to destroy the countryside. So, the U.S. may have like destroyed the country, but it didn't militarily win the war, and it certainly didn't have any kind of political influence over the Vietnamese. Morale among the Vietnamese people, among the Viet Cong supporters was very high. They're fighting for their own country.
Mhm.
Among the Southern Vietnamese, who are kind of forced to fight, not so much. And the Americans are just other than the soldiers, the U.S. isn't really feeling it at that point, early in the war.
Yeah.
And so, they never were able to kind of stop and reflect and try to ruminate on what was going on.
Mhm.
Never, even if things got bad, or even if the media started asking questions, or even if there was an anti-war movement, they just kind of, like we're seeing today, just kind of, doubled down and did more until they didn't.
What was the feeling at home? I was not alive during this
Yeah.
time. So what was the feeling like? I've seen some interesting documentaries. There's still a moment during I guess the late 60s where, the big three networks would give as a filmmaker a whole bunch of money to go around and just ask questions to random Americans. And I remember watching one where I believe they were in New England, and they were asking how people felt about the war. And overwhelmingly, people that would probably be conservative coded today hated the war because their kids were coming back either drug addicted, maimed, or in a box.
Yeah. Early on, until like 1965 or 66, there's not a lot, because most Americans, are focusing on things, as King said at the very beginning in that excerpt you read.
Mhm.
Most Americans were focusing on what was happening here at home, the Great Society and civil rights and all that. But by 1965, you started to see kind of the outlines of an anti-war movement. You started to see SDS had a rally. You started to see teach-ins at places like MIT. Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn were deeply involved in the first stages of that. It was funny, in the teach-ins, the administration at the beginning actually would send representatives to debate people like Chomsky and Zinn and professors like Gabriel Coker or William Atman Williams. People from the Department of State, fairly high-ranking officials who were just getting destroyed, right? The students are jeering at him, and they're cheering Noam and Howard and everybody else, so they quit doing that. And then in 1966, the Senate got involved, and I think that's vital. I know we all, I'm pretty down on electoral politics myself, but having somebody like J. William Fulbright, who was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, hold national hearings on Vietnam, which were very critical, and bring in people like George Frost Kennan, a very famous diplomat, one of the architects of the Cold War, who condemned Vietnam. I think James Gavin spoke at those hearings, who was, I think, the commander of the 82nd Airborne at D-Day, or very high up. And I think that really was important in getting, as you pointed out, I think that's important. People who would code as conservative today turned on the war. And a lot of that had to do with the body count, the body bags.
Mhm.
You mentioned the news. I was pretty young at the time, but vaguely remember that they would talk about that at the end of the week. Walter Concrete or whoever would say, this many Americans were killed in Vietnam. And that increasingly started to get to Americans, not just like kind of liberal hippie Americans. And, being a liberal at the time was pretty much mainstream, right?
Mhm.
But it really kind of got to a lot of people because, after a while, most people had some connection to somebody who lost somebody in Vietnam, right? It may have been 2 or 3 degrees separated, but, it was coming home. And, obviously, it was damaging Johnson's program. The Great Society, civil rights by 1965 is really kind of in the rearview mirror. And especially, I think, when you open with King's speech, I often open my classes the very beginning of the semester with that. And, I think that's so important to understand that. King in that speech called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, which is stunning in 1967. So, I think the liberals had turned on him, as you pointed out, too. So there's this general unease about Vietnam, and it was growing. You started to see more and more protests. The March on the Pentagon in 1967. Campus protests became more and more prevalent. And then, by 1968, the whole thing kind of blows up. All hell kind of breaks loose with the events in early 1968, the Tet Offensive and so forth. And by that time, the American people have said, okay, we've had enough. During the Tet Offensive, the highest casualty rate in 1 week was something like 2,100 Americans killed in Vietnam. And I believe Time magazine featured in an issue a picture of every American soldier killed in Vietnam, right?
Mhm.
Which at the time was very powerful. These are the days before, electronic media. So you get your Time magazine and you see those pictures, and it really struck a chord. And a lot of people are saying, like, we got to take care of our people here. Why are we in Vietnam? There's universal condemnation. I mean, in the United States, there's an anti-war movement. The rest of the world, sound familiar, right? The rest of the world is saying, what the hell is the U.S. doing,
Yeah.
right? And I think, there's a different story after 1968 and after Tet. And the U.S. does finally start to kind of wind things down, but that's going to take a while and still create an intense amount of destruction. But the anti-war movement, really grew. It became vital. But I think the main difference is, like, today, we're seeing both the Republicans and Democrats, kind of jump on the bandwagon. You're pro-Hamas, you're an anti-Semite, and Israel is our friend, and all that kind of stuff. That wasn't the case. And by 1967, 68, you had mainstream politicians not just like, somebody like Bernie Sanders today is really an outlier. At the time, there were a lot of Bernie Sanderses, and they were increasingly coming out against the Vietnam War. Fulbright, the George McGovern, kind of the main characters, but also Republicans, John Sherman Cooper, Mark Hatfield, Jacob Javits. So it became kind of okay inside the establishment to criticize the Vietnam War. And I think that's really important as well, just to kind of create a larger, zone in which people could, a space in which people could criticize the war. And so by 1969, the major protests were actually massive, and they were taking place in communities all over the country. The mobilization to end the war, the moratorium. And this is when you had really, and the images are very stark, right?
Mhm.
In 1965 or 66, the protests, you'd see the kind of long-haired kids with, flowers or whatever. By 1968 and 69, you're seeing businessmen in suits, women referred to as housewives, clergy, and so forth. And so, and it's clear, and Nixon understood that when Nixon, ran for the office. He said, I'm going to end the war. I have a secret plan to end the war.
Mhm.
And when he became president, he, began to withdraw troops from Vietnam, although he intensified the air war.
Yeah, in 69, he intensifies it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but he also, by 19, and if you want to go back and talk about any of this, feel free to ask, but by 1968, after Tet, the United States had 540 or so thousand troops in Vietnam. Within 18 months, Nixon had that down to 180,000. So Americans, and the biggest concern is always going to be, American kids dying in Vietnam. So Nixon kind of handled that. He massaged that, but he intensified the air war against Vietnam and also against the Associated States of Indochina, Cambodia, and Laos, which both had communist, insurgencies going on at the same time, and which all came to power as well. Indochina became totally communist by the 75 era, 75, 76. But the anti-war movement, I think, was really vital in that regard. The most important part was the Vietnamese, right? They fought, they resisted. The Viet Cong, Ho Chi Minh, Van Nguyen Giap, the usual suspects in the Vietnamese pantheon of revolutionary leaders. But the U.S. response was important. The media became more critical. In that regard, I think, I hate talking about lessons of Vietnam, but I think the ruling class learned a lot of lessons better than other people have, right? In terms of how to repress people and how to suppress the media and attack dissent and all that kind of stuff. Because thinking, and then, obviously that in terms of the anti-war movement, it kind of reaches its, I wouldn't call it a peak, more like a nadir in May of 1970 with the murders at Kent State, the state-sanctioned murders of 4 students in Ohio, and then a week or two later at Jackson State.
Yeah.
And, the war really came home at that point.
And that's the reason why we don't see that anymore, right? We don't see the cops just opening fire. We see cops opening fire for different situations, not protest situations.
Yeah.
Because they don't want another Kent State on their hands. That creates martyrs and movements and.
Yeah. Well, and we had the great pleasure this morning. We interviewed the directors of the Encampments, which is a great documentary about Colombia.
I met that guy. So I'm on the Means TV because I have my own series there. So we all had a meeting. Last week. So I met that guy.
And what's striking is there's a little bit of a background to Hins Hall, which was Hamilton Hall, and after Columbia, the NYPD came into campus in 1968. And after that, Columbia basically had an agreement. We will not invite NYPD back to campus. And that was kind of the operating procedure for a long time with regard to students. They're not necessarily sanctuaries, but we're going to kind of take it easy there. It took Columbia, I think, 7 to 10 days to call the police in for the occupation of Hamilton Hall. And the SDS and these guys were like in the dean's office. They were drinking a scotch and smoking the cigars, and and they waited, and they were fairly patient compared to what we're seeing today. So, I think Kent State really was a wake up, right? These are our children. I grew up at 45 minutes from, like, right now, I'm less than an hour from Kent State. And, it's still a contested terrain in that regard. But I think it really scared, you don't send your kid to college to get killed on campus.
No.
No matter what your political views are,
Which is, I don't know if you felt the same way when I saw the protest, because Kent State and Jackson State, these are smaller state universities. When you talk about Columbia, You talk about Princeton. You're talking about Ivy League universities where these kids that go there are going to graduate and work for McKinsey and Deloitte and Touche and be the people that are kind of part of the war machine in a different way, right? And for those people, even if you can, even though it's like, well, this is kind of a trendy thing, you can say, and you can say because of identity politics, the lens in which they understand this conflict is white Israelis suppressing brown Arabs. We're going to stand against it, regardless the reason, the rationale. The repression has been insanely overblown, and it starts with Biden.
Sure.
Right? That was. Were you shocked? Did it remind you of the 60s a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I guess and it's hard to say you're shocked when you're as old as I am and you've seen a lot of stuff, but you know, these protests were so like the current round, right? The last year or two were so nonviolent and really, kind of exactly following that kind of Gandhian King kind of influence. And the state just went heavy. And like you pointed out, that's important to understand. There's Democrats too, Kathy Hochul and Eric Adams and Gavin Newsom. I mean, the repression at UCLA, I think, was as violent as anything you saw in Texas.
Yeah.
And just funded by Jerry Seinfeld, right? So I think that really was chilling. And last spring, I lived in deep fear every morning of waking up, seeing that police opened fire and killed some of these kids at Columbia or wherever. And fortunately, that didn't happen. But we saw in the summer of 2020, they're going to be vicious and violent. And clearly that's a shift, and which is why to kind of jump ahead, when the Vietnam War ended, by then I was a teenager, and I thought, well, we did it. We ended this war. Nixon resigned, right? I said, America's different. It's not going to be like that anymore. Well, obviously, it's way fucking worse than that now. So, but it was it's very chilling and it's very striking. The one piece that comes out of this that I think is somewhat encouraging, because the Vietnam War was popular at the first, right? Why not? I mean, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, they wouldn't lie to us in Vietnam, and America has to save these people from communism, all this kind of stuff. And Americans turned on it. They turned against the war. And that's happened much sooner in a much more rapid fashion. That's something Chomsky always points out that I think is important, because he understands this better than I do, obviously, and anybody really in that regard. The resistance to what's happening today is occurring at a much more rapid pace. I mean, it took a few years. Well, if you start at 1960, it took several years for Americans to kind of start to pay attention to Vietnam and turn against it. Right now, I mean, Israel, other than among, white Republicans over the age of 50, no demographic any longer supports Israel. And that's happened in like 18 months. So in that regard, I mean, I think it's easy to become hopeless because it's pretty bleak, but the resistance is there. And it's occurring at a fairly rapid pace. Now, the repression is probably going to be greater as well, which is the downside to this. But, there's just a million different ways this could go. But I've noticed when you hear a lot of these younger people talk today, they often say that they've studied the anti-war movement in the 60s, or they're familiar with it at least. And that's kind of given them some motivation and some ideas about how to do it.
We do have a super chat question here from Dave L. Thank you, Dave L, for the super chat. To what extent does Bob buy the quote replacing France theory of the U.S. assisting broke post WW2 France with its colony in Vietnam?
I mean, that's an important part of it. Yeah. Against America's better wishes. FDR took on this kind of mantle of anti-colonialism during World War II because he understood that's the way the world was drifting, right? And not necessarily for altruistic reasons. I'm kind of going off script here for a minute, but because I always make this point because I think it's important. In World War II, the United States has two goals. First, of course, is to defeat Germany, right, and Japan, to defeat the Axis. Number two is to dismantle the British Empire. So Britain was really close to Germany in terms of being a rival of the U.S. because their imperial preference system was keeping the U.S. out of all these markets. So when Roosevelt comes out and saying, I'm anti-colonial, That's because he wants those markets opened. And a lot of those places are going to be, or were British colonies or French colonies in the case of Indochina, right? So the United States definitely wanted France not to go back in, both because it thought France's role should be focused on Europe, because there was a communist party in France and in Italy and in Greece and a lot of places in 1945 and 46 that was winning elections. The United States was way more concerned about elections in France and Italy than it was about what was happening in Indochina. But they didn't want to alienate the French, and they didn't want to facilitate a victory in the elections in France by the French left. So the U.S. began to, did a quick reversal on its advice to France and essentially said, what do you need? And gave them virtually a blank check, all the way until Dien Bien Phu in 1954. So that's really a critical issue there, as well as what I said earlier about how they wanted to kind of create Asian capitalism and countries in Asia that could, be economic partners with Japan, initially China, but obviously that fell by the wayside. So Japan became even more important after October 1st, 1949. And so, but yeah, absolutely. The French piece of that's really important.
We have another super chat here. This one from Prairie Fire Kowalski. My favorite class from high school was Decade of the 60s. How this nation survived 1968 is insane. The music, space race, Great Society, civil rights, Vietnam. Class is gone now. Too woke. You lived through 1968, but you were a young Bob at the time. You're probably still Robbie.
Bobby.
You're Bobby. Oh, you're Bobby. Yeah.
They still call me that in my hometown. So yeah.
I was actually thinking about 68. I didn't know how I wanted to open this, or want to talk about my disdain for hippies, or did I want to, at least open on it?
Hippies in 1968 were a lot easier to deal with than looking back on hippies, though, right? But
I mean,
well, you said that no one.
I look at 68 like this. It's an interesting year because depending on who tells you the story, and you're a historian, so I hope you appreciate this. Depending on who tells you the story, it's the greatest time and the saddest time. It's the beginning and the end, all in one year. Woodstock happens. Begin. You hear. If you hear the right person tell it, you think Woodstock happened in like April. Woodstock happens in August, towards the end of August, right around my birthday. Altamont, same year, end of the year, and Altamont is supposed to be the end of that moment because a couple people died. Hell's Angels were security. The same people that put Woodstock together put Altamont together. Same thing happened at Woodstock, happened at Altamont. Couldn't get the right place to do it. You move locations last minute. As someone that's worked in festivals, you can't move locations in a week. They did that twice in the same year. People died at the first Woodstock. There were rapes at the first Woodstock. First Woodstock had one bathroom for 300,000 people. I don't know why that's a success and Altamont is the failure. It always depends on who tells you the story.
Sure.
But that's just, I'm sorry.
You no. I mean, it's funny because we definitely romanticize a lot of that. And it's something as a professor, because it's a good way to get students interested when you talk about these issues, like the Summer of Love. Summer of Love was like a bunch of, there were a lot of like 15-year-old girls being, abused and raped and things like that, and drug overdoses and things like that. Yeah. So we do tend to romanticize this. And one thing, I don't want to dampen people's enthusiasm, especially students, but I have to say, keep in mind, there were like 50,000 people getting killed in Vietnam, and you had the FBI killing Black Panthers, and you had, Cesar Chavez trying to organize farm workers because they were being denied water in 110-degree heat and things like that. So yeah, there's clearly a romanticization. 1968 is an important year. A couple of things happened early in the year. One, of course, the Tet Offensive, which everybody knows about. Another, which I think in retrospect was probably more important, was there was the global economy was on the verge of a massive collapse in early 1968. It's a long, detailed kind of Byzantine story, but at the time, the United States was still on the Bretton Woods system, a gold standard, and the Europeans were concerned about American spending in Vietnam, the American commitment to Vietnam. So they began cashing in the gold. They literally would send planes to take gold back. This is what's the French Connection, right?
Yeah.
So the kind of global ruling class at that point said this has to end. And even before the election in 1968, LBJ understood that, and the military understood that, and they began to start to put into motion a de-escalation of the Vietnam War very slowly. But 68 is a pivotal year. Then, just a month or two later, Johnson withdrew from the presidential campaign.
Yeah.
And then a few days after that, King was killed in Memphis. And then Bobby Kennedy's killed.
Bobby Kennedy,
and it's
yeah. Do you think things work out different if Johnson doesn't withdraw?
He would have beaten Nixon.
Kennedy?
I do believe. I don't like doing counterfactual stuff, but
Yeah.
because people always say Bobby Kennedy would have been the nominee if he hadn't been killed. No, he wouldn't have. The Democrats at the time did not have an open convention process. Humphrey was going to be the nominee. It was over. But I do believe Johnson would have beaten Nixon. Absolutely. Johnson was a superior politician. I've been saying that a lot lately. I study LBJ, and if LBJ was president today, this wouldn't be happening.
Mhm.
He would, as he would say, I'll grab him by the balls. He could be very crude and gruff, and he would, he would have control over this process. I mean, somebody like Trump would just be a rookie, compared to LBJ. LBJ was as sinister, but he was also really smart. Unlike these idiots. So yeah, that's unfortunate. I think it's funny. LBJ's a war criminal like everybody else, but I have some sympathy for him, probably more than pretty much any president of that era, actually. So
Is
I
it
do
because
think
of the way that he came into office? Is that why?
Well, I mean, being a Texan who had a shitty record on civil rights, and then kind of shepherding the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act through Congress, standing there in a speech saying we shall overcome, is worth mentioning. It's worth noting. I think in 1965 that was stunning, and people like King were, and even Malcolm X were shocked by Johnson's apostasy to the ruling class on that. And then in Vietnam, he just inherited a really shitty situation from JFK, and it would have been a lot easier. I don't know how much you want to go to. It would have been a lot easier for Kennedy to get out of Vietnam than Johnson after Kennedy died. So I have some, the Great Society, it's liberal reform, it's limited, but hell of a lot better than anything we've seen since then. So I have a tiny bit of sympathy for him. I'm aware of his, flaws for sure, and the way he treated the civil rights movement and King, especially after that.
After the Vietnam thing. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean,
Yeah,
King,
bad.
that year. We were talking about 1968. King is also helping organize a boycott of the Olympics, and I always tell students, like, I don't know if the Olympics are a big deal anymore. I don't think they are, but in 1968, that was like the epic battle of the Cold War. Who would win more medals? And American medals are disproportionately being won by African American athletes. And so for King to say, let's boycott the Olympics, oh my God, that's treason, and he's organizing the Poor People's Campaign. And so it's really a cataclysm. When all this shit began around 1920, and people were becoming at that time, I thought kind of out over the top and hysterical. I would also say, hey, it's not 1968. Well, I mean, 1968 doesn't look so bad today, but it really was a catastrophic time.
Do you think? I mean, we could do a whole show on 68.
Yeah.
Maybe we should. Do you think culturally it's a different time? When I think of 68, I think of these upstart movements that are happening all around the same time, right? And I shouldn't say happening like they're just starting, but they're really coming into their own. You have the Panthers, you have like Chicano rights movements, you definitely have women's rights movements. There's a lot of
a year later.
Stonewall is about to happen. There's a lot of something in the air, right? That a change is going to come, as the great song says, the Sam Cooke song, if I'm not mistaken. It's 2025, and I don't think anyone cares to hear the great anti-war anthem. I think you can release it if you want. Taylor Swift could release it if she wants to. I don't think it's going to do anything. I don't even think she'd bother to do it.
Yeah. Well, the anti-war anthems are now being used in TV commercials.
Yeah, you have fun with that.
Yeah. I mean, it's all been commodified.
Yeah.
the protest of that era has been commodified and therefore depoliticized, which is, I think, the real tragedy of it. Yeah.
I don't think people like anyone that believes in like the revolutionary capacity of music today. I have to look at you with a side eye and be like,
Yeah.
really? After the Nike commercial in like '88 or whatever that was, when they had revolution in the shoe ad,
Yeah.
like once that happened, it's over. Everything's gonna sell something.
Yeah. Who was it? Wrangler used Fortunate Son in an ad to sell jeans, right? One of the
Yes.
most hardcore anti-war songs you're going to hear, and they're selling jeans. And yeah, I used to teach a course just on the 60s, and I had a file just of like commercials like that with like 80 or 90 different examples of that, right? In it. The revolution will be commodified, right? So,
Well, yeah, now you're seeing these artists, some artists from that era, and you can't fault them depending on the contracts they sign. I think people have a very, very skewed understanding of how the music industry worked, when people actually were making money. The window ain't that big.
yeah.
And you're seeing these guys sell off the rights to their music for hundreds of millions of dollars of upfront money.
Yeah.
You can call them a sellout if you want, but it's like, look, man, those quarterly checks are barely coming in.
Yeah.
And the amount of musicians that have massive hits that you remember forever, like Dick Dale.
Yeah.
Reading the end of his life, he's performing with a colostomy bag.
Yeah.
Just to pay the bills. He could barely even move. If someone would have offered him, $100 million for the rights to his catalog, I'm sure he would have given it over in an instant.
There's always, I think, been an overemphasis on these kind of cultural or celebrity ideas, and it's nice to get publicity, I guess. But I think there are a couple entertainers in U.S. history who've kind of made a difference that kind of stepped out, like Woody Guthrie and Paul Robeson, maybe Dylan, but it's far and few between. And they're certainly not revolutionary catalysts or anything like that. And I think, and students, that's what, well, not so much anymore because they're so young now, but for a lot of years, that's what students wanted to talk about, or they wanted to hear about the music, and it was funny. They would ask me like, were you at Woodstock? Like, Christ, how old do I look? And for a long time, and I would I'd introduce them to Phil Oakes and Gil Scott-Heron and, all kinds of cool stuff. Right. And, but that became the story.
Yes.
As it's a distracting, right? It's a spectacle, right? I always encourage people to read Guy Debord, The Society of the Spectacle, one of the best, kind of Marxist pamphlets of that era. But I think that's kind of people focused on the spectacle. I think this began with a talk about culture, which I think important, because what I find striking is that in the 60s, the whatever you want to call them, the liberals or the left or the hippies, I think they won the culture wars, right?
Yeah.
Back then, I mean, now you can go online. You can gamble, you can order tobacco. People have told me you can find porn online. I don't know if that's true or
not. You can, Bob. I'm not going to show you
I'll take
how.
your word on it. Right? And now that's all. Like, Republicans live together and they smoke dope and they're freakier than shit. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, they're the freakiest people going around, right? And it doesn't matter. So the left kind of won the culture war, but who cares, right? Who cares? It doesn't matter. And that's why this kind of focus, and I'm sure you and I'm pretty sure we see eye to eye on the kind of focus on things like, identity politics and being woke or whatever. And that's not a good word either, because, cancel culture is really a far more right-wing thing than we don't have the power to cancel people. I wish we did. I would do it in a minute. But it's students at Columbia who, Jewish Voice for Peace gets canceled as being anti-Semitic, so. But the culture of the 60s, I think, Kinsey and Hugh Hefner were incredibly influential in that era. The creation of birth control pill, all that.
I wrote about 99 Woodstock and juxtaposed it to 69.
Yeah.
And I will say my bad. I said 68 to 69.
Yeah.
I forgot. Shit. And the pill is kind of an important factor in a lot of the sex you see in 69, because as certain feminists had written, and not many, there was an implied yes
Mhm.
because of this pill. And we're still dealing with women being able to say, no, no penis for me now. And not all the sex you saw at Woodstock or think you're saying was like uber consensual. Again,
Yeah.
as there were reported rapes.
Yeah.
About the same as 99, which people don't
Mhm.
want to believe, and they say, well, 99 was much worse. Women didn't even report them back then because it was 99. It was a different time. I'm like, well, why do you think so many were so willing in 69? You thought
Yeah.
everybody just wanted to fuck a guy with long hair? Like, that's just not
Yeah.
how that works.
Yeah. Well, there's a really well-known book about that. It's called Personal Politics, and a lot of the women who created the first wave of kind of women's liberation actually got their political start in things like the civil rights movement or the anti-war movement. And the men in those groups who are supposed to be the good guys, right? They're fighting the war machine, and they're fighting this oppressive racial system and all that. They treated women the same way as everybody else did. And so
Mhm.
women did feel guilty, if they wouldn't sleep with the guy, they'd say, "Oh, what are your hangups?" or "You're uptight," or all that kind of stuff. And so it really was, very much a coercive relationship. And yeah, again, we romanticize that, but no, there's a lot there. It's fun to listen to the music and the peace, love, and flowers in your hair and all that kind of stuff. But the underbelly of it is very ugly. Absolutely.
Well, we'll have to bring you on. We do a music show on this
I'd
channel,
love to.
and we talk about you might dig this. We talk about an entire year
Oh, cool.
of music.
Yeah.
There was a reporter, a music journalist that said these are the 15 greatest years of music, and we've done so far. We added a few of our own because we were like, "Fuck that guy." We so we've done 95, 94, 93, 82, 79, and 67. So we still have to do 68, 69, 70, 71. Like we have a bunch more to do. So if there's any particular year that you feel like you really want to, like, this is my year because this album came out and I want to but we get into the inventions of 67 is the year that multi-track recording is available. Guitar effects pedals come out that year. And again, we talk about pretty much every record, no singles, records
Yeah.
uh, that we can find. We make a playlist of every album we can find on Spotify. It's a lot of fun. So if you want to join us for one of those, you
Yeah. I don't think I've listened to anything new since like 2000. Uh,
so you'll be
I-
perfect.
it's funny. I keep going back, and it's Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Gil Scott-Heron, Stevie Wonder, a bunch of jazz, Jackson Brown.
I'm wearing a shirt of an album that is released the year of my birth,
Really,
1977.
1977. I am
1977.
well. I pointed that out to you. I'm a huge Steely Dan fan. I just live with them. Everything. I just think they're geniuses. And I play Kid Charlemagne in class when I talk about Timothy Leary. Nobody gets it, but it's just like I want to hear it. Uh,
You got to come down here when you visit Mexico, and you
yeah.
listen to Gaucho in its entirety on the terrace,
Oh
looking
yeah.
out into the ocean.
Yeah.
It's the perfect record for that.
When I hear Steely Dan, it's 1977. I'm on the roof of my dorm or fraternity or whatever in college. I got a joint in one hand and a beer in the other hand, and the world is just perfect at that moment. So
When you make music that sounds sonically that good,
yeah.
say what you want about the band, ladies and gentlemen. I believe in my soul, if you put this record on Asia from start to finish in a halfway decent sound system, you can hear everything. And it's just magic. Magic comes through your speakers.
It's beautiful.
I do want to ask you this question before we go. John F. Kennedy. A lot of people believe that he wanted to pull out of Vietnam, and that had something to do with his assassination. Is that true?
Absolutely not. No evidence of it, none whatsoever. Kennedy, again, this is one where I could go on for the rest of the evening, but Kennedy ramped up the American commitment to Vietnam progressively. He sent in, when Kennedy took over, there were 800 advisors in Vietnam. By late 1963, there were 16,000. He sent in armor. He sent in helicopters. He started to use napalm. He started to put American advisors in combat operations as advisors to the Vietnamese forces. At the same time he did that, he was also ramping up the subversion of Cuba. He was escalating the Cold War, basically provoked the Soviet Union at the Cuban Missile Crisis, could have blown the world up. They talk about Kennedy being the hero. Kennedy almost blew the world up in October of 1962. He increased military spending that entire period. The people who support this idea that the deep state killed Kennedy because it's the end of the war don't have any evidence. Well, so-and-so in 1954 said to this other person, and I read it in an interview 30 years later, or, somebody tweeted this out about what he heard, and John Kenneth Galbraith said this and all that. I've studied this pretty closely, and I've read as many documents as Jeff Morley or the other people who've done that have, and there's just no evidence. And, this is kind of a mantle that I took up from Chomsky. We actually did a couple shows on this, and he wrote a book on this called Rethinking Camelot, which is when I met him. And so since then, I've really kind of focused on this quite a bit, and I've written extensively on it. And there is just, the point is, what happened in Dallas on November 22nd, 63, I don't know. I mean, I'm inclined, I know I'm really outlier here. I'm inclined to believe that it was Oswald, but killing the president of the United States, assassinating the president of the United States is a really big fucking deal. I have to say that. I have to say it that way. You don't do that on a capricious whim. You don't do that because he didn't like Northwoods, right? 3 weeks before Kennedy was killed, he approved a coup to overthrow and assassinate, well, not to assassinate, but to overthrow No Dinh Diem and his brother. If you're trying to get out of Vietnam, you sure as hell don't approve a coup to get rid of the guy you put in there and then create incredible, chaos within the Vietnamese government. Even after the October Missile Crisis, he ramped up intervention in Cuba. After the missile crisis, the U.S. Supported these Cuban exiles who blew up a factory in Havana and killed 400 people, right? I mean, this is something that I get. This isn't really fun. I mean, it's fun to talk about it, but it's also gets me because, I'm not Oliver Stone and I don't have his reach. And so it's just, and the left is picking up on this, and the left is making a hero out of Kennedy. And I don't believe anybody should have heroes, but sure as hell not JFK. People forget when QAnon started, QAnon's two heroes were JFK and Martin Luther and Donald Trump, right?
Yep.
They consider them the same thing. They're still waiting for Kennedy's JFK Jr. to come back.
And that's the whole thing, that he's not really dead, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There's just no evidence of it. And I've written a ton on this. I hope to write more. I should write a book about JFK. I've been working on that for a long time. So, but no, there's just isn't. And, Kennedy is just it's funny. Years ago, I had a professor who was pretty moderate conservative. And he said, there are like two main Cold War characters who were really responsible for more than anything else. One was Dean Acheson, who was Truman's Secretary of State, and the other one was John Kennedy. And I think most people who study this would say the same thing. Kennedy was a rabid, blood on the talons Cold Warrior. But Oliver Stone has decided that he is, this kind of second coming, and there's just no evidence for it. I mean, many of the documents they were online a while ago. Trump may have taken them down. Who knows what the hell's going on there? It's also the last thing I'll say in this, because I don't want to go on too much of a rant, but I think it's funny. It shows, I think, the vacuity of their argument when they keep saying, release the documents, right? Release the documents so we can find the truth. Yeah. They've been arguing for 60 freaking years that so-called deep state killed Kennedy. Kennedy is the deep state. Kennedy's the government, right? They think that these documents are going to expose their role. I mean, if these guys engineered a hit on the fucking president of the United States, they're certainly going to cover their tracks. You're not going to. I've looked at the new documents as they're released. They're somewhat useful, but there's nothing in there. Why would you say, "Oh, release the documents, we'll see the truth"? Like, if you really believe in a conspiracy, then you would.
Why would they write it down?
Clever enough to. Yeah. Why would you write it? You don't do that. You don't fucking do that, right? Yeah, they're not tweeting it out. They're not on Truth Social, right? It's just nuts. It's just. Why? The idea that the Pentagon would want to kill Kennedy, he was taking care of him. He was one of them. He was in that world and of that world. So the idea that there's this, like the whole lefty obsession with, if you want to do a show on conspiracies, I'd love to talk to you about that, because
Mhm.
I think that's a big problem with the left. Everything is conspiratorial. Now look at this, look at that. It's like, no, it's just like, we know who these people are. They're not really
It's not a
hiding.
secret. Yeah, no, it's not
they're
a secret.
hiding.
Yeah.
I mean, like Netanyahu's like bragging about genocide, and Biden, was very clear, about American support of Israel. And so it's just, it's insane, and there's just no evidence. And as a historian, even if the truth is troubling and I don't like it, you got to kind of have to look at it, and I think it's a problem with the left. The heroicism of Kennedy and others is just,
I mean, that's
Kennedy
been
ain't
my
going to
whole
save
thing.
you.
That's been my
Yeah.
whole thing here. Like, I don't dig heroes. I think
Yeah.
if you're all about heroes, you're gonna get your feelings hurt, right? You're gonna find out they did something that is against your moral code,
Sure.
and you're gonna look at them differently, and you're gonna forget anything they did. Like MLK, you're gonna find out that he fucked around,
Yeah.
and now he's a two-timing husband. And why would you believe a two-timing husband? It's like, I don't know. I don't give a shit. I don't give a shit if my plumber fucks around. So why would I give a shit if he does?
Yeah. There was a great, years ago, I read a review of something Dylan had done, and the last line was awesome. I wish I kept it, but it was talking about, Dylan's flaws and all this stuff. And the
Mhm.
last line was something along the lines of, but remember, he's a genius, not a saint.
Yeah.
And exactly. I mean, well, I mean, these people also, like, in addition to saying Kennedy was killed by the deep state, portray him as a civil rights hero, right?
Mhm.
He turned the FBI off against King. He turned the FBI to go after King, right? They bugged his rooms. They threatened him. Like, King had to drag and kick Kennedy to do anything, and it was actually Johnson who took care of it, right?
Mhm.
So this heroicism, Martin Luther King. I don't really care what he did in his personal life. That's up to him and his family,
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah, they have to deal with that. They have to.
I shouldn't say I shouldn't say this, but hell, I watch Woody Allen movies all the time. I think they're amazing, So
Yeah, all of a sudden, hey, what happened to all our viewers, Scott?
yeah. Frank Sinatra was not a choir boy, and I listened to my whole life.
But if you listen to anything, there's a good chance that the person you're listening to isn't a decent individual by whatever your moral code is. They've done some foul. I've gotten to see myself some people that I admired growing up going, oh wow, no shit. Okay. Well, but yeah, I'm not the heroes guy, and this ain't the hero show. But I do appreciate you, Bob, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me. And now we have some future shows. We got to do a conspiracy show. We got to do a Kennedy show just to piss you off, and we got to do a 68 music show with you.
Well, I'm sorry I wasn't able to be with Scott when you did the show about your wrestling film.
Yeah.
I'm in the process. I just retired not long ago, and I was in the process of moving back to Ohio, and so I had 3 or 4 weeks there where I was just out of pocket the whole time. So, but
well, we got another episode coming up. Hopefully soon. We'll get episode 2 up. So if you guys want to talk to me again,
yeah, absolutely, we'd
is
love to have you on again. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's when we get into to OJ and some other fun things that happened along that time, and news media and how we digest it. So I think y'all will dig it.
And thanks for the invitation to Tijuana, which I remember Krusty the Clown saying was the happiest place on earth. So.
And I'm a little further south. I'm in Rosarito, so it's even nicer. It's even nicer where I am. But yeah, Tijuana I'll be there probably tomorrow afternoon doing some work because I love it, and it's supposed to be a wonderful day. So thank you,
I don't know
Bob.
if you're a Simpsons fan, but Krusty took the kids there on a field trip. So
there's parts of it they shouldn't go, but I know that episode.
Yeah.
But thank you, Bob, and have a good night.
Thank you so much, and cheers, and I really appreciate it, and you do great stuff here. It's really cool to see kind of this other left media, which is really vital nowadays more than ever. So.
Also, wherever you're watching or listening to the show, there should be a link in the description to the Green and Red podcast where you can find Bob more often than not with his co-host Scott Parkin, who's also been on this show. I was on their show, maybe a month ago.
Not long.
It
Yeah.
was around time you moved. It was around time you moved because you couldn't
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
there 'cause
Yeah.
you're moving.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Bob. Have a very
Thank
good
you.
evening,
You
and I
too.
appreciate you.
I'm a bit.
What'd you say?
No, nothing. No.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
All right. Peace out.
Take care, man.
Bob Buzzanco. We got to get Bob on the red zone too one of these days. But you know what would happen if Bob comes on the red zone, right? Bob comes on the red zone. We spend the first 15 minutes of the show actually talking about sports. We spend the next 2 hours of the show showing Bob how to find internet porn. There's a good chance that's going to happen. I feel confident that my sports show co-host, the beautiful Michael McGinnis, I feel very confident if he found out that that was the case. And McGinnis and Bob are both Ohio natives. Oh, yeah. He's going to sit Paw down. Okay, Paw. We're gonna show you how you can find, and then we'll show Bob how Tinder works. That's what we're good for. We're good for being horrible surrogate children. That's what we're good for. Right? If you need that, there's me and there's Mac, there's Toussaint. Good, horrible surrogate children. If that's what you need, we're here to fill that role. We will program your VCR. We'll hook up your iTunes. And we'll show you how to look at internet porn and Tinder. Now, if you are a patron of this channel, we're going to go watch a ridiculous film. I'm going to try to set that film up here. Because I too am old. I might have to Google, how do I do the thing? But we're hell or high water. We're fucking watching this. If I have to move computers, we are watching Hard Ticket to Hawaii. If you want to join us, there's only one way. Become a patron for as little as $3 a month, $30 for the year. You can join in the insanity that is these new ridiculous movie nights. We had so much fun watching Deadly Force, Stony Cooper. When the law doesn't go far enough, Cooper goes far enough. And because of bad editing, you see his whole hog. You saw his whole hog in the scene. So, Andrea says Tony Cooper was a man's man. So let's go have some fun in the champagne room. Patreon.com/Bitterlake Presents if you want to join us for this fun movie night. We do it a little differently. It's the fun movie night. So again, this movie is going to have all the things that would cause a warning. So just know that you're going into all the things. It's going to have all those bad things. I'm telling you now. So don't complain about it later. Oh, I didn't know the people were going to fuck on a motorcycle on the beach. I told you all the bad things. All the bad things. Andrea says it's snakes and boobies. Snakes and boobs and explosions. So again, it's like a 12-year-old wrote it. Hey, Billy, what do you want to see in a movie? Boobs! Okay. All right. Do you want him to do anything? Blow stuff up! Oh, okay. And what else? Maybe like a ninja. We can do that. We can do that. And see, Snackway says, how is that bad? I'm trying to end the show and I can't. Thank you guys. Again, thank you, Bob. Thank you, Scott, also too. Shout out to Scott Parkin for reminding me who the fuck Bob Buzzanco is. So Mercutio, who is one of the more insane commentators on the show, wasn't there with us for the last movie night, and that was kind of sad. Sean Moon, of all the people who should join us for movie night, if you message me, email me, Mooney, I'm going to call you Mooney from now on. Email me, Mooney, and I'll send you a link because you deserve to watch this film. Every time you comment, it's always sad. We need to cheer you up. This movie will cheer you up. At least like an hour and a half of some goofy shit. We all need that sometime. So it's booking at thisisrevolutionpodcast.com is the email. I'll see you guys soon. Peace.